Thanks, Susan. Thank the AAPG and all the uh, event coordinators and organizers. I can imagine all the time and effort goes into planning something like this. So I'm here today to talk about regulatory timelines for closure. What we're going to do is take an example of kind of legacy and historical oil and gas producing area and just look at some of the events that have led to regulatory reform and just different changes in their environment over the course of the last couple of decades, but then use that to extrapolate across several other different areas that are very similar in nature. As Susan mentioned, my name is Graeme Hawkins. I'm the Director of Asset Retirement Obligations with 360 Engineering and Environmental Consulting. 360 is an engineering and environmental firm based in predominantly Western Canada. We have about 150 engineers and environmental scientists, as well as a group of financial assessors that are a part of my group, which is around asset retirement obligations. On the screen there, you can see some of the different jurisdictions and areas that we've done ARO reporting. We have collectively to date done about $23 billion worth of assessment for ARO across all of North America as well as South America. These financial reporting assessments are relied upon by publicly traded institutions for financial disclosures, as well as we often get involved in M&A activity in Western Canada, looking at different liabilities, as well as regulatory approvals within that process. And so we're actually going to be dealing with what is the oldest jurisdiction for a well drilled in North America. And I'll preface that by saying it depends on who you ask. But in Oil Springs, Ontario, the first well was drilled in 1858, 1 year before the Drake well in Pennsylvania that really spawned an industry. And so within that time frame, obviously a lot of wells were drilled. So on the map there, you can see this is based off of the Ontario government's petroleum well map. And you can see all along kind of the seaboard of Lake Erie, all the way up through to kind of the green belt as well. There was roughly 27,000 known oil and gas wells that were drilled since 1858. Between the late 50s and into 1950 as well, production really started to decline as major plays in kind of Western Canada and other jurisdictions started to become a little bit more lucrative. And so you were left with a lot of declining production and inactive sites as operators tended to go elsewhere. At that time, historical regulations, which has been a bit of a theme through the presentations today, were not necessarily up to today's standards. So regulations currently are still related to the care and custody of dealing with the P&A activity for these wells is left with the operators when the operator is known. Obviously, when the operator is not known, the actual liability and the obligation then lies with the landowner. And so when you think about these 27,000 known wells, much of this is on farmers' fields or in rural communities back in the 1950s when a lot of these operators moved on. And so what happened since then? I mean, population began to boom. You had developers moving in, similar to Mike's previous comments around residential development, started to expand into some of these fields where you have housing developments, schools, shopping centers that are being built in extremely close proximity to these now orphan and idle wells, and in some cases directly on top of them. The P&A standards of the time, if they were suspended or abandoned, were fairly rudimentary. They're not up to today's kind of engineering and scientific technologies and standards. And so these wells were relatively left unchecked for about 70 years. And more recently, we're starting to see events that are causing this regulatory reform. What are we doing with these wells, and what are some of the impacts that they're having? And so here are a couple of those examples that we're seeing. So when we think about events, and the slide's kind of called Catalyst for Change, again, these wells have been relatively unchecked for 70 years. Not much went into them. Wasn't a lot of inspection requirements. The P&A standards were fairly rudimentary. And we ended up with several catastrophic events. Again, seems to be a similar theme in some of the presentations over the last several hours, whether it's in Colorado, Oklahoma. These are two examples of wells that were leaking methane and that ignited. The first one at the top there was actually a home that was built in close proximity to an abandoned well that had been leaking methane that actually resulted in 2 fatalities. The second one at the bottom there, if you were involved or if you were in the room for my colleague Adam Derry's presentation, this was the example of the Wheatley water well that exploded, causing significant both public and private loss in relation to the town, as well as several different buildings in the close area. And so what has Ontario done to try and mitigate some of these issues and some of the problems to date? So in the last, call it 10 to 15 years, they're doing something, but not necessarily enough. The first kind of program that they initiated was called the Abandoned Works Program. This is a provincially funded program that allows landowners, if they know of these orphan and idle wells on their property, to submit closure plans and say, we will prepay for this closure work and then be reimbursed by the province. To date, roughly $30 million has gone out through the Abandoned Works Program that only abandoned roughly 415 wells. So it's something, but definitely not enough when we think about the 27,000 known wells that are out there. Just recently, based on some of the events, particularly around the Wheatley gas explosion, the province has increased the funding for the Abandoned Works Program and allocated about $2 million to 9 high-risk municipalities in that trade area for emergency response planning and different activities to try and mitigate further catastrophic events. Other examples of some of the updates and regulatory action that the province is undertaking. In 2023, they procured a bit of a gap analysis in terms of other jurisdictions, both in Canada, the US, and internationally as well, and what are they doing to try and deal with some of these legacy wells. They looked at different liability management frameworks, security mechanisms, and tried to start from, okay, we know we don't have much, but what are other jurisdictions doing to try and mitigate some of these problems? And then most recently, they've looked at procuring a financial assessment of all of these wells. What would it take? What is the baseline? What do we think it would actually take to go in, either re-enter or properly abandon these high-risk wells to mitigate, again, further catastrophic events, further losses of life, and damage to property and the public. So when we think about kind of Ontario, and again, some of the different examples that we've heard today, you're thinking about an aged jurisdiction, extremely old assets, some of the oldest, obviously, in North America. Currently, it's very limited existing production and an industry that is fairly non-existent as, again, many operators have moved on and moved westward or into other areas. Historical regulations just haven't caught up. This has been a bit of an afterthought from ministerial perspective and aren't necessarily conducive to mitigating these high-risk assets. Continues to be lack of operator accountability, if there are any, and I think that's a big problem that many other jurisdictions are facing as well. So you're left with a substantial orphan inventory. Lack of industry funding to deal with this problem was a foresight, which you can't necessarily fault them for, but we're thinking over 100 years ago, no one would have thought we'd probably be in the position we are today. And so not necessarily conducive to figuring out, okay, we should probably be setting aside some of this or taxing or levies in order to deal with this in the future. And frankly, there's just a lack of understanding of how big of a problem this actually is. When we think about 27,000 wells, those again are known to the ministry. Some estimates say that number is roughly 2x that, so over 50,000 actual wells. And so that again, as we look at development and further advancement into these rural areas, the unknown orphan wells, these unknown idle wells, and even the variances of the 27,000 that they do know of, some of those variances can be upwards to 3 feet to 3/4 of a mile. And that could be the difference between, again, being in a farmer's field and being under a school. The picture on the right there is, again, just highlighting this isn't an Ontario problem. This is something that several legacy jurisdictions and legacy oil-bearing states as well are dealing with. And so you can understand if it's a problem somewhere, it's probably the same everywhere else. And so if we think about Ontario's kind of reactionary approach, so they are trying to deal with the problem, and we give them credit for dealing with that, but it took, at the worst case scenario, a loss of life to get to this point. And so what other opportunities are out there to try and get ahead of the problem? So there's lots of different technology services that are here. Again, where are these wells? And I think that's kind of one of the main things that we need to focus on today, as well as into the future, is identifying how far has residential development or commercial development stretched into these legacy fields. And so using different types of drone technologies and emission capturing technologies to identify and get and reduce the variance of locations to where these wells are. One of the pieces that I'm probably most passionate about when we think about asset retirement obligations and kind of quantifying liability is just really getting a grasp of the magnitude of this problem. When we think about the 27 to 50,000 wells that are just in Ontario and then extrapolate that across multiple other jurisdictions, we're in the millions of orphan and idle wells, and just what is the total magnitude of that? What is the underlying cost? A lot of the a lot of the jurisdictions that are dealing with this is again reactionary. They're having to take public funding, which ultimately comes down to the taxpayer. They're unable to hold accountable these operators, and so you've got a tax base that is having to fund these problems. Where do we start? How do we start to tackle some of these? And so if you understand what the full magnitude of that liability is, you can start to appropriate necessary funds to deal with the problem. And then finally, one of the key pieces for kind of this forum is really the performance grants that came with the DOI's bipartisan infrastructure law. So the funds that were allocated to multiple different programs. There has also been grants that have been set aside to deal with strengthening some of these standards. And so we think about historical regulations that weren't necessarily up to snuff, so to speak. There are performance grants that are available to regulators as well as states to strengthen those plugging standards. So something that may have been historically okay, we know is now not. And so you can apply for up to $20 million and have 10 years to update those standards, get them to a more technological and advanced state, as well as improvements to state programs, looking at funding mechanisms, different structures to hold operators accountable so we don't continue to deal with these problems as, again, this inventory of legacy assets and more of these kind of marginal wells may become orphaned that are going to continue to be a problem for many years to come. I made up some time. If there's any questions.
Everybody online to be able to hear your question. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So in the state of California, every operator for every well that they drill, they will have to purchase a bond with the state to guarantee that the well will be taken care of if they go out of business. I was just wondering if that is the case in Alberta or Ontario.
In Alberta specifically, there are bonding and security requirements for operators. I think the difference there is Alberta is still very much an active industry. There are still lots of operations. There's not lots of new wells being drilled. So there is still an underlying kind of revenue base for industry to proactively pay into either an orphan fund or be held accountable to closing out these assets. Ontario is a little bit different. There was minor bonding requirements at the time, but again, there wasn't necessarily the enforcement of holding those operators accountable. So several of them left, and where did that bonding go? They didn't ever actually go in and abandon those wells, and if they did, they weren't necessarily to the standard when we're thinking about from the 50s when they left to kind of 70 years later to where we are today. So the answer is yes and no, so to speak. It really is, again, coming down to what is the total magnitude of that. Is $3,500 adequate to go in and plug some of these wells? That's the question. I have my own opinions, but some of the bonding requirements just aren't enough. Yes.
Nathan Mahan, Texas A&M. Graeme, thank you for a nice talk. Does any of us seriously think that had there been a much more substantial fund required, that people might have had to pay in some portion of revenue or something to establish the thing, that governments wouldn't have rated that for some other purposes along the way and it wouldn't exist? I mean, I hate to sound cynical, but I just don't think that, you know, the reason the bonding has managed to survive is it's really small.
Sure.
And had it been larger target, the money would be gone. And at least in one state, it kind of already is. And so there's got to be there's alternative funding potential other than bonding / some mechanism of capturing revenue from operators.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's definitely a balancing act there. You don't want to do something that is going to detract from investment and operators to be able to perform these activities. Do I think if it had been larger, would it have been rated, so to speak, and used for other opportunities or other mechanisms? Potentially. Again, when I think about other jurisdictions, again, Alberta being one, there's multiple other provinces that are dealing with it. There's other states as well, where there's enforcement in place to not allow that. And again, I think it does have to do more so to the fact that those industries are still very much active. When we think about some of these legacy sites and legacy jurisdictions, there just isn't enough of a base there. The ship has already sailed, so to speak. So there isn't an industry that can support that. So in the case of Ontario, to say, okay, we're going to go to the existing operators and say the bonding requirements or security requirements are now in place, there's just not enough of a base there to really make a difference. Do I think something would have been better than nothing in a lot of cases? Probably. But it's a little too far gone at this point. Okay. Thank you.